Hi, welcome back to another Serger tip clip. Lately, I've been in tote bag making mode, and I came up with a great way to make a very sturdy, durable strap that's beautiful as well for tote bags, and I wanted to share the technique with you. So this is the tote bag, and here is the strap. And if you remember, I did a previous tip clip on the belt loop binder. And this one actually uses both widths, the 1.5 inch one and the 3/4 inch belt loop binder. So I'll show you how I combine them, and it gives added strength, but I think it's super pretty too for this tote bag. So we'll go over the components and I'll see you in just a minute. Here's the strap that I'm going to show you how to make. And as I said earlier, I use both belt loop binders. The wide one is the strap that's underneath, and the narrower one creates the kind of the trim one on top. And not only does it add a little bit of pizzazz to the strap itself, but it also increases the strength of it. And I have a couple of little tricks for how to really get stability on that. So on this strap, the 1.5 inch belt loop binder makes a finished strap of about 1 inch. And the narrower one, which is the 3/4 inch belt loop binder, creates just about a 1/2 inch wide finished strip when we're done. Before I go to the machine, I want to show you some of the components that we're going to use for making this strap. And I've already cut my strips of fabric. I used a quilting weight cotton for this tote bag, and I incorporated 2 of the fabrics into the straps. This wider strip, which is just a hair narrower than 2 inches wide, is going to be the base part of the strap. And this strip, which is about 1 inch wide, is going to be the trim. And you can kind of see even flat how it's going to look. But the whole secret to really keeping it strong is grosgrain ribbon. So for the base piece, the wider one, I've cut 2 pieces of 7/8 inch wide grosgrain ribbon, and I'll show you how to incorporate that in the strap with the belt loop binder at the machine. And for the narrower piece, I have a 3/8 inch wide piece of grosgrain ribbon. So I don't need a double one for the narrower one. I think it would maybe be a little bit of overkill as far as the strength goes. But the 2 wider ones really give it a lot of heft and make it a nice feeling strap and give it lots of strength too. So this is the narrower belt loop binder. This is the 3/4 inch one. And I have the wider one already set up on my machine. And again, I will refer you to that earlier Serger tip clip on the belt loop binder for how to set it up on your machine, how to get it so that your stitching is centered, and be ready to go for this technique. So I will see you over at the machine in just a minute. I'm all set up at the machine, and I have the wider belt loop binder on the 1.5 inch, and I've already tested my strip of fabric to make sure that my stitching is centered on it when I go to put the fabric in. But let me just do a recap of the grosgrain ribbon part of this. As I said before, for strength, I am using 2 pieces of the grosgrain ribbon. Now, one thing I didn't mention in the introduction was that if you're using a fabric that's heavier or thicker than a quilting weight cotton, you are going to have to test the grosgrain ribbon with that, because you have to remember you need it to feed smoothly through the mouth of the belt loop binder. And if the fabric is thick, using 2 layers of the grosgrain ribbon might create a little bit too much thickness for it to feed smoothly. So always test before you actually try it out, just to be sure it works. But I do know it does work perfectly fine with the quilting weight cotton. So I've got my 2 layers of grosgrain ribbon. And as always, in the cover stitch mode, you have to start with your fabric under the needles, and I am set up for a wide cover stitch. I have my left and right needles in. You could do this with a triple cover stitch. There's no problem with that at all. You could also do it with the narrow cover stitch if you had your center and right needle in, or center and left needle, depending on whether your machine has a preference for one or the other. However, you don't have quite as much of a quote-unquote fudge factor for making sure that you catch both sides of the folds in the belt loop fabric. So that's why I like to use the wide one. And actually, you'll never see the chain looper side of the stitch, because I'll show you how I put the two strips together. So I have this under. I'm going to turn my hand wheel so that I've anchored it with the needles down. And now I'm going to pull this along. And as I said, this is wider than what they describe for the correct width on the instructions that come with this. And it's because it has to go around 2 layers of the grosgrain ribbon, and it takes a little bit of pushing along, and you can see it kind of bunching up because I do have those the double layer of the ribbon in there. But let me push it along and see if I can get it to come out. Yeah, I just see it peeking, so I'm going to grab it with my tweezers. This is probably the hardest part of the whole thing. I'm going to pull it along, and I don't have to pull it all the way under the needles, but I do want to move the fabric far enough forward so that the feed dogs can grab it. So now that I have something to hold on to with this, I'm going to just pull that along. And it does look bunchy, but once it gets going, it will be fine. And what I'm going to do is pull back, because it's bunched up the ribbon underneath. So I want to smooth that out. So that's flattened out again. Get this under my presser foot. And I have the clear foot on so that you can really see what's going on. And I think I mentioned in the original tip clip to always cut a longer length than you need by several inches, because oftentimes it takes a couple of inches at the beginning and the end for everything to stay organized and look good. So you want to be able to have that extra length to chop it off and still have enough for what you want your finished strap length to be. So that's just a little tip of mine. So we'll get this going. This is not folded under, but I don't really care because that part is going to be cut off anyway. So I have my stitch length on a little bit longer than 3, which I think will be fine. I have a contrasting kind of a rosy red color in here so that you can see the stitching. All of my settings are on normal. My tension settings are normal. My differential feed is on 1 or N. And I think I am ready to go. And the beauty of the belt loop binder is that it's basically doing most of the work. You want to stitch at a relatively slow speed, slow to moderate, just so that you can keep everything organized. And I like to keep my finger on top, just rested on top, so that the fabric doesn't have a chance to pop up. So, and in this case, because I've got the 2 layers of grosgrain ribbon, I said before to always keep your fabric between the little bumpers or guardrails right down here. But on this, it doesn't really matter. As long as you keep it fairly centered as it's feeding through, it should be fine. So let's see what we have. And you can see that now that I'm in about 2 inches, the fabric is organized and folding correctly. So that's what we're looking for. And this is a short length because I don't think I need to do a full 45 inches for you to get the hang of how I've done this. But I'm just letting the machine take its time, stitch along. And I'm just chaining off. Let me clip my thread tail. And one thing I didn't mention before was be sure you cut your grosgrain ribbon longer than your strip, because again, that has to go in first and go forward. But here's what I mean about having your fabric strip cut longer. It took a little bit of time for this to fold over and both edges to get caught correctly. If I had cut this, say 50 inches or 55 inches, I would have more than enough space to chop off at the beginning and at the end, although the finished end looks fine. But you can see as I went along that this caught both edges. There is a little bit of the ribbon peeking through, but guess what? That's not going to matter because I'm going to show you how I do the narrower one. And this is all going to be covered up. So this isn't going to matter. If I were just doing this as a single layer, that would be a concern. I'd probably want to make sure I covered that ribbon completely so that it didn't peek out. So what I'm going to do next is set up the narrow belt loop binder. We'll do the second strip and that will just have the single ribbon. So I'll see you here in just a minute. Okay, I have switched out the wide belt loop binder for the narrow one, and I have my 3/8 inch ribbon in, and I think I am centered on this, and I have my narrower strip and I've cut my little arrow, and this has the single layer of grosgrain ribbon, so this should slide through pretty easily. And, you know, I don't know about you, but on batik fabrics I always have kind of a hard time telling which side is the right and the wrong side, but I think I've got this fabric right side up, which you always do want to make sure that when you feed your fabric into the belt loop binder that you do have it right side up. And I mentioned that I cut this one about 1 inch wide, which again is a little bit wider. And the reason for that is the turn of cloth. The first one looked very bunchy going through at the beginning, but because I had to wrap around that double layer of grosgrain ribbon, I needed more width for it to get caught on the underside. And the same thing with this, even though it is on a single layer of the grosgrain. And I'm just going to lift the presser foot, make sure this is up far enough for the feed dogs to grab. And let me just pull that ribbon back without pulling the fabric back. You can see that. Okay, that's smooth. So I think we are ready to go on this. And again, same exact process, just resting my finger. I'll put my tweezers down. I don't need those. And I think my stitching is just a little far left, but so this will just be a little tutorial of just moving this over. And it's a very subtle amount of movement to get that stitching centered. So, and if your stitching, again, is too far left, which this was, move the attachment to the left. If your stitching's too far right, move it slightly to the right. But again, you'll know that on your test fabric strip. There we go. I think that looks good. You don't need quite as long a length of ribbon at the end, but that's just the length I cut it. So there we have our second one. You can see on that narrow one, the wide cover stitch did a great job pulling both edges together and holding it, and that the ribbon was fully encased on that. So it's very good. The next step would be just to give it a nice press, and then you're ready to combine the two of them. I have both of my strips finished, and as I said, this is just a sample one so that I've got them kind of short. But I've trimmed off either edge, the beginning and end edges. And now, as I said, you're never going to see where that ribbon didn't get fully covered, because the way I like to attach these is putting the wrong sides together. Okay, just like this. So you have a nice, clean looking strap from the front and the back. So I'm going to, one of my very, very favorite notions, Wonder Tape. And now this is wash away, but chances are I won't be washing my tote bag. But what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to put it on the back of the narrow strip. And there are a couple of different things. I guess if you wanted to use fabric glue, you could. If you wanted to spray some temporary adhesive spray on the narrower one. You could certainly do that too, just to hold it in place. And the only reason I'm doing this is so that when I go to stitch it, I don't have to manage anything. So the Wonder Tape does all the work for that. I give it a nice firm finger press. It's a double-sided fusible tape that has this little paper over it. I'm pulling it off, just like that. And what I'm going to do is just center it on the wider strip. And you can reposition it. So if you're a little bit off the mark and you want to readjust, you certainly can. So just going like this. So let me make sure that edge is nice and even as well. Just like that. So you can see that the strap is going to look great. And let me just grab the actual tote bag and show you that it is. Here are my two straps, and clean as a whistle on both sides. And while I have this on, the way that I would stitch this on is on this particular one, I used a neutral colored, very lightweight, I think it was 100 weight thread, and did a very narrow zigzag just so that the stitching line would kind of disappear. And if you wanted to use a straight stitch on your sewing machine, a narrow zigzag, or pick out a decorative stitch on your machine to attach it, all of them are great options, and that's your choice. And I do have one other tote bag that I can show you how that little decorative stitch works. So let me grab that. And here is this tote bag. And the nice thing about this decorative stitch is that I was able to incorporate some of the blue on the decorative stitching into that. And I use that little buttonhole stitch to attach the strap to that, but there is Wonder Tape under here. And one little variation that you can see on this is that rather than using the wide cover stitch, I used a triple cover stitch. So those are all options that you can use, and they're all great, but clean and nice on both sides. So I hope you enjoy that. I think it's a great option and strong. And the other thing is, and I mentioned this in the original tip clip on the belt loop binder, is that if you wanted to cut your straps on the bias, if you were using a plaid or stripes or a pattern that worked well on the bias, as you know, the bias grain line is very stretchy. That grosgrain ribbon will hold it very firmly, very smoothly, and you won't have any problem with the straps stretching out, especially if you have something heavy in your bag. So that is my little tip for super strong straps on your Serger tote bag. Thanks for joining me today, and as always, be sure to subscribe to my channel so that you'll get a note in your inbox for when I post a new tip clip. And if you have any questions, please send them along. I'm always happy to hear from you, and any suggestions for a future tip clip. Thanks very much, and see you again soon.